It would sound a little more organized, but quite loud.
Yeah. But yes, that was it.
It was, we would possibly be playing to 2 or 3 people sometimes. And then sometimes, you'd be playing to a somewhat larger. Well, there's always been this kind of odd idea about guitar players. They want to know who was the quickest, who had the best skill, who could perform the most improbable solo.
I never really thought of it that way.
I never saw the guitar as a competition. I wasn't sitting backstage somewhere calculating my money, wondering if I could perform better than the guy down the road. Half the time I was probably thinking if I'd shattered another perfectly excellent guitar I couldn't afford to repair. But I had guys who would cut me off.
You'd hear something and you'd think, bloody hell, what's he doing there?
And I don't mean something complex per se.
Sometimes it was one chord, sometimes it was the sound.
Sometimes it was just the way a guy stood there with a guitar and somehow the whole room felt different. I was lucky because I grew up during a crazy era for guitar players.
London was full of them.
You'd walk into a club and there'd be some young fellow creating sounds that nobody'd heard 6 months ago. Then someone would come from America and suddenly we'd all have to rethink what we thought we knew. And certainly, guitarists are bad at admitting that another guitarist scares them a little.
We are competitive beings even when we think we're not. I was definitely.
But age does something useful. You stop worrying so much about where you stood in the pecking order.
You remember the folks who truly made you listen.
There were not many.
These were the ones who did well. Eric was tough to miss. You have to remember what London was like. Everyone knew everyone or appeared to know everyone.
You'd hear this guy's name in a pub, then someone would say, "You need to go and see this guy." And all of a sudden everybody was talking about Eric Clapton. There was something very controlled about it with Eric.
He needn't have jumped about.
He didn't need the sort of theater I rather appreciated. He could just stand there and play and the guitar appeared to talk for him. I recall hearing what he was doing with John Mayall and thought that he had found a way of making the electric guitar sound really powerful without making it ludicrous.
That blew me away. Because I was doing something entirely different.
I was attracted in noise, loud chords, feedback, devastation. I wanted the guitar to be a part of the whole performance.
Eric didn't need any of this to catch people's attention.
He had this preternatural touch. And that's a word guitarists use too much, right?
Feel. But Eric had really had enough. You could hear a few notes and you knew who it was. That is far more difficult than playing fast. Lots of people can learn to play quickly. Only a few acquire a voice that is purely their own. Eric was serious back then too.
He was treated like some sort of high priest of the guitar. The famous "God is Clapton" thing was already circulating throughout London, which I always thought was a little silly.
Eric probably did, too.
But underlying all the craziness was a hell of a player. We were quite different guitar players and I suppose that's why I noticed him.
I never wanted to be Eric Clapton. If I tried, I couldn't have become Eric Clapton. But I'd listen to him and I'd think, yeah, he knows something about this instrument I don't.
And another guitarist might make you think you remember him. Jimi was different again. I knew about him long before Led Zeppelin was this huge thing. If you were around studios and musicians in London in those days, Jimi's name was everywhere. He was one of those individuals who seemed to turn up on albums without anybody entirely knowing he was there.
And he could play anything. That's what I liked about Jimi. He understood the guitar as an orchestra conductor understands an orchestra. It wasn't just about performing a clever solo.
He knew where the guitar was supposed to sit, what sound it needed, when to come in and, most crucially, when to shut up.
I just loved that so much.
And then, of course, there was Zeppelin.
I remember hearing them and thinking, Jesus, that's huge. Not loudly. We were all noisy. We'd already done our fair share of hurting people's hearing by the time we were the Who. I mean huge, in a different way.
Jimi had learned how to get the guitar to fill this vast area. There were acoustic passages and weird tunings and strong riffs and delicate bits, all these layers working together. You could hear his background as a studio musician in it, but it didn't sound clinical. It sounded like trouble.
And Jimi had a good imagination. That's sometimes what people miss when they talk about great guitarists.
They will talk technique for hours. Of course, technique is useful, but imagination is far more uncommon. Jimi could make something relatively basic sound mysterious. Listen to how he developed riffs.
You'd hear one and know immediately that it was his.
It had weight, it had character.
Are we in competition now?
Bloody right we were. In those days bands kept a very close check on each other. Nobody hesitated to say it, but if Zeppelin put out an exceptional record, you took notice.
If something amazing happened with Hendrix, you saw it. If the Stones unearthed another amazing riff, you knew it. You went home with it in your head. Jimi was that kind of guy. He made you go home and think I didn't want to play like him. That was never the point.
I was impressed that he had made a universe of his own with the guitar. You heard Jimmy Page and within seconds knew exactly whose universe you had entered. Keith is a weird one, since people sometimes speak about him as what he does is easy.
Yes, well, that's the goddamn point.
Keith knew something very early on that a lot of guitar players never know at all. You don't need to fill in all those empty spaces.
You don't have to show you're a guitarist every 5 seconds.
Sometimes you hit the right note, you put it down in exactly the right place, and all of a sudden you have a record that people will still be listening to 50 years later.
I always liked that.
The Stones and The Who were obviously contemporaries, and there was competition amongst bands.
There must have been.
You'd hear a new Stones record and you'd be like, oh, they've done it again. And a lot of times there was Keith somewhere in the thick of it.
Not trying to show off. Just moving the whole dang thing. That's challenging. Keith has a cadence about him that's almost impossible to teach. You can copy the tuning.
They can purchase the right guitar.
They can learn the riff.
They can stand in front of the mirror and try to make themselves look like him. But they still don't sound like Keith.
Because the essential bit isn't what he's playing, it's where he's putting it. There is a looseness about him.
But in that looseness lies an astonishing understanding of time.
The guitar has a slightly different role in the song.
It pushes, then hangs back, then all of a sudden there is this great nasty chord and everything makes sense. I was probably more aggressive as a player.
Half the work was being done by my right arm.
The Who were doing big chords because I was often attempting to fill a huge amount of space.
Keith didn't have to do that.
He had Charlie Watts.
He had Bill Wyman.
And he knew how to wriggle himself between them.
That's musicality. Keith survives everything.
People love to make jokes about that, and Keith promotes half of those jokes himself. But there is a very talented musician below the legend.
In fact, far cleverer than he likes people to think. And I suppose that's why his playing lasts. You can wow someone for 5 minutes with technique. Keith found riffs that impressed people for eons.
Jeff was scary.
I don't mean on a personal level.
Jeff could be humorous, tough, charming, impossible, sometimes all in the space of an afternoon. But when he held a guitar in his hands, you never really knew what was going to come out of the bloody instrument.
And that is what impressed me.
Even really brilliant guitarists, you know the mechanics.
You might listen carefully and think, yes, I see what he's doing there. With Jeff I couldn't very often.
He looked like he was having this private chat with the instrument. I remember the Yardbirds time quite well, because that band became really intriguing all of a sudden, when Jeff was in it. There was distortion, sustain, feedback, all these noises that guitarists were beginning to find out.
But Jeff didn't think they were accidents. He took advantage of them. That was meaningful to me in that I was covering some of the same ground in my own way. Feedback was not merely an unpleasant noise that occurred when you stood in the wrong location. It could be a part of the music. It was an instinct Jeff recognized.
But then he would alter.
And it was another thing I liked about him.
He never did appear to be that interested in being the version of Jeff Beck that everybody wanted him to stay.
He could have remained in one cozy area for decades. He didn't. He kept on after noises.
And then when I heard him play later, he got this incredible control with his fingers and the tremolo arm. Sometimes it was hard to discern where the guitar ended and Jeff began. He could make a note curve and almost breathe.
You don't learn that from books.
There are many guitarists who have technique. Jeff was interested. He was still looking to. I guess that's why guitar players respected him so much. We understood how hard parts of that was, but Jeff made it not seem like an exercise. He didn't have a big neon sign over his head shouting, "Look how intelligent I am."
He just did something no one else could do. And that's probably the highest praise I can give another guitarist. You could give Jeff Beck practically any guitar. Within seconds it sounded like Jeff Beck. Well, Jimi was something else entirely. But it's hard to put into words since everybody knows what Hendrix became.
You have heard the recordings, seen the images, seen the footage of him holding the guitar behind his head or setting the bloody thing on fire. But think of him, when none of that was history yet. When he was just this guy who'd come to London.
That was another thing.
And the first time you truly heard Jimi was this uneasy feeling that the rules had shifted when nobody was looking. The instrument suddenly stopped behaving like a guitar.
It was yelling, singing, bursting.
And the irritating part was he made it look easy. I was bashing guitars and hurling myself over the stage, and here was Jimi doing things with the instrument that were theatrical, certainly, but behind the theater was this great musician.
That was the thing. People may remember the fire and forget the hands. Jimi didn't need the rails.
He could sit and play calmly and still startle you.
I remember the speed of news throughout London.
Musicians wanted to visit him, guitarists especially. You'd look at him and then at the guy standing next to you like, "Did you just see that?"
What could you say? Obviously there was blues in there. There was something entirely new, though. Music became feedback.
Distortion was lovely.
He could make a tremendous racket and still be really expressive somehow. That interested me very much.
The Who had been experimenting with volume and feedback.
When Jimi showed up, I recognized some of the territory.
But with that, he went somewhere else.
And, yeah, there was competition between us.
Then there was competition between everybody. Even Jimi and the Who had that famous dispute over who would follow whom in Monterey.
Neither of us was anxious to go on after the other. I think that says something to you. We knew what he was capable of. But what I take away is not so much Monterey, or flaming guitar. It's the experience of hearing someone and knowing you're witnessing a real transformation.
There are great guitarists.
There are outstanding guitar players. And then every once in a while, someone comes along and makes every other guitarist rethink the instrument. That was Jimi.
He sure did that to me.
So there you have it. Eric, Jimi, Keith, Jeff, Jimi.
5 quite distinct guitar players, which is probably why I remember them so well.
I never thought there was a right way to play the guitar. That's crap, actually.
If we did, we'd all sound the same, and what a terrible, dreadful world that would be.
Eric could make a handful of notes sound big. Jimi could construct a whole environment around a riff. Keith understood rhythm better than most people know their own pulse.
Jeff was determined to find noises we hadn't thought of before.
And Jim? Well, Jimi changed the subject. But adoration doesn't mean you want to be somebody else. That's significant.
When you're young, you hear a great guitarist and your first reaction is to try and mimic him.
You want his guitar, his amp, his tone.
You begin to move your fingers like he does.
Eventually, if you're lucky, you learn that's not the job. The aim is to find out what you sound like. I was never going to be Eric Clapton. I wasn't going to be Jeff Beck.
And there was no damned way I was going to wake up one morning and find I could play like Hendrix.
So, I did what I could. I played giant chords. I used the feedback.
I windmilled my arm till my shoulder must have wondered what crime it had committed.
And it became my voice somewhere along the way. Really, that's what all these guys taught me.
Not how to play guitar, but why your voice counts. Technique becomes old, fashion changes, equipment changes. But when you strike one note and you know who's playing right away, then they've done something exceptional.